The first 100 words, as requested, open in a visually gripping, emotionally haunting tone. The silence in the old bus depot tasted of rusted air and forgotten breath. Shadows clung to the rafters like reluctant memories, peeling away only when the wind pressed through the broken windows with a sigh too weary to be called a voice. The place felt abandoned twice over, once by people, and once by time itself. Dust floated in slow spirals, as though grieving, and the cracked tile under my boots echoed with the faint, impossible rhythm of footsteps that didn't belong to me. In that hollow dark, every corner whispered of loss I hadn't yet dared to name. The depot had stood at the edge of Greenville since the late 70s, long past its usefulness, long past its purpose. Yet I always ended up here, pulled by something older than duty, heavier than reason. Maybe it was the way the building seemed to breathe in the silence, exhale regret with the shifting light. Maybe it was because I could hear her name here, even when the wind was still. Lena Mercy Doyle. 22 when she disappeared. A laugh like river glass catching sun. A girl whose absence felt like an unfinished sentence no one had the courage to complete. I didn't know her, not in the way that mattered, but there were nights I convinced myself I did. Nights when her face hovered beneath the thin membranes of dreams I didn't remember asking for. Nights when I told myself the case was still open for a reason, that my obsession was nothing more than persistence wearing a badge. But this depot, this place made me feel as though she were standing just beyond the edge of the shadows, the corners of her silhouette dissolving each time I tried to focus. Some truths don't need bodies to haunt the living. I moved deeper into the depot, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly, not from fear, I told myself, but from the cold. The walls were tattooed with graffiti, some fresh, some old enough to have lost their meaning. A warped bench leaned crookedly against the far wall, its slats splintered, its metal supports bowing in defeat. The vending machines sat like tombstones, their glass faces spiderwebbed from decades of vandalism. It wasn't the space itself that unsettled me, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't arrive naturally. It settles, like dust on a memory, after something has been taken away. I paused near the center of the depot where the tiles changed color, a circular stain, faint now but unmistakable. Rainwater, perhaps, or something else claimed by years. My chest tightened anyway, the way it did when I stood in the corridor of the police archives staring at Lena's case file, my fingers resting on the edge as if touching its cardboard spine could resuscitate something inside me. The hum of distant traffic seeped through the cracked doors, but it only emphasized how alone I was inside this decaying relic. I wanted to believe I'd come to retrace steps, to search for angles missed by investigators long retired or long buried. But the truth was simpler, more unsettling. I came here because the silence told the truth in ways people never could. It held the shape of what had happened, even if the world had forgotten. The depot's ceiling groaned under a shift of wind, dust raining down like tired confessions. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I imagined the faint outline of a young woman waiting on a bench, clasping a bus ticket with shaky hands, the last person to see her pretending not to notice her nervous smile. Memory plays tricks, silence plays worse ones. And yet I stood there alone, letting the shadows crawl closer, letting the atmosphere settle into my bones. Because in the stillness I could almost sense the truth, quiet, cold, patient, watching me from just behind the veil of what I thought I knew. It began with a box the color of winter-stained parchment. It arrived on my desk before sunrise, when the precinct still smelled of stale coffee and yesterday's unasked questions. No return address, no note, just my name penned in a hand I didn't recognize, thin strokes, hesitant, almost apologetic, as if the sender feared waking something painful. The box weighed almost nothing when I lifted it, but my pulse reacted as if I were holding a ticking confession. Inside, cushioned by yellowed newspaper, lay a single object, a small, tarnished locket on a rusted chain. Oval-shaped, delicate, its surface etched with a faint pattern worn nearly smooth. The clasp was broken, the hinge slightly bent. It hadn't been opened in years. But I recognized it, not because I'd seen it before, but because its image lingered on the edges of Lena Doyle's file, listed in the inventory of items she was last known to possess. The photo was blurry, enlarged from a friend's snapshot, but the shape, the engraving, it was the same. I had stared at that listing 100 times, circling it mentally, wondering why something so personal had never been recovered. Now it sat in my palm like a quiet accusation. Who sent it? Why now? And why to me? I noticed something else. The chain was tangled around a bus ticket. A ticket stamped June 14, 1990, the night she disappeared. The date felt like a pulse inside the paper, faint but insistent. My throat tightened as I lifted the ticket. The ink had bled along the edges, almost like tears. My hand trembled before I could stop it. A whisper of dread slithered beneath my ribs. This wasn't merely evidence resurfacing. It was memory wadding back from the depths, dragging something unseen behind it. The moment I touched the locket, the room felt smaller, the air colder. The fluorescent lights buzzed low, flickering as though recoiling from whatever truth I was inching toward. I closed my fist around the locket and felt its metal bite into my skin, a sting that felt almost deserved. Had someone kept this for decades, hidden it, worn it? Or was it intentionally placed, wherever I'd be forced to confront it? The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit, because the object wasn't a clue, it was a summons. I found myself back at the depot within the hour, the locket heavy in my pocket, the ticket tucked carefully between the pages of my notebook. The morning sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to soften the building's harsh silhouette. Its windows glared at me like tired eyes refusing to sleep. Inside, the air felt even colder than before. Shadows slumped across the floor, stretched long and empty. I walked slowly, the echo of my steps trailing behind me like an accusation. Near the back of the depot, I found something I hadn't noticed before: small scratches on the wall, shallow yet deliberate. 3 vertical lines crossed by a slanted fourth. Not graffiti, not random. A tally. A counting of days. Or heartbeats. Or regrets. My chest tightened as I traced them with gloved fingertips. The texture beneath the dust felt raw, intentional, urgent. The symbolic object had awakened something. Or someone. The disappearance wasn't just resurfacing, it was circling back, dragging me along with its tide. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the locket wasn't merely found. It was returned. It became clear in the hours that followed that I was no longer looking at the case. I was being pulled into it. The precinct bustled around me with its usual rhythm, murmured reports, ringing phones, the scrape of chairs across linoleum. But it all felt muted, distant, as though I were listening from behind soundproof glass. My focus narrowed to the locket on my desk, and the unsettling sense that my hands were shaking too much for comfort. I told myself it was the gravity of new evidence. But I knew better. My involvement with the Doyle case had always been personal, not in a way I could justify, not even to myself. I wasn't assigned to it originally. I wasn't even working in the department when it happened. I was 12 years old in 1990, living 3 streets over from the bus depot, listening to my mother whisper prayers into the dark every time a young girl went missing on the news. I remembered Lena's poster taped to the grocery store counter, the grainy black and white photo, the hopeful eyes, the words missing, please help, that felt like a hand reaching from somewhere cold and desperate. I had stared at that poster longer than a child should. Something about her expression, open, uncertain, quietly brave, lodged itself in my mind and never left. 29 years later, her file was the one I found myself returning to when the precinct quieted. Not out of duty, out of something closer to longing, a longing for answers I couldn't name. Or maybe for redemption I hadn't yet earned. My colleagues teased me gently about my nighttime hobby, unaware of how often the case kept me awake. How often I found myself tracing the lines of her last known movements in my mind like an incantation. Now, with the locket sitting inches away, my obsession no longer felt abstract. It felt summoned, directed, as if the case had been waiting for me. I opened her file again. I didn't need to, I knew every page by heart, but I needed the ritual, the routine of it. Her photo looked back at me, expression soft, almost hopeful. I swallowed hard. "Why now, Lena?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. It wasn't a question meant for the room. It was meant for whatever part of me kept coming here, kept returning to her story like a wound I couldn't stop pressing. Duty kept me tethered to the process. Chain of evidence, procedural notes, careful documentation. But obsession tugged me elsewhere, into the slipstream of memory, into shadows of places I didn't want to revisit. I remembered the night I stood outside the old bus depot at 17, long before I became an investigator. I'd gone there on a dare, but something in the air, cold, heavy, expectant, made me back away without crossing the threshold. My friends laughed. I didn't. Years later, I still felt that same instinctive prickle whenever I approached it, as though the building held breath when I drew near, as though something inside recognized me. Obsession isn't loud, it's soft. It sounds like a whisper you mistake for your own thoughts. It feels like a hand turning your head toward the dark. The locket glinted in the corner of my vision, catching a sliver of morning light. I exhaled shakily. The urge to open it felt primal. I resisted. Not out of caution. Out of fear, not of what I'd find, but of what it would confirm about me. Because the closer I came to Lena's truth, the more I felt the thin edge of madness pressing against my ribs, urging me forward. Duty gave me reason. Obsession gave me purpose. And under the dim hum of the fluorescent lights, I realized something unsettling. This case wasn't consuming me. I was willingly stepping into its mouth. The case didn't come alive in the evidence locker or on my desk. It came alive in their faces. The first time I saw her sister, I almost didn't recognize the resemblance. Hannah Doyle waited in interview room 2 with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She looked younger than her 30-odd years and older than her grief, if such a thing is possible. Her hair was pulled back in a careless knot, stray strands frizzing around her face like static. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only a simple, washed-out yellow dress that made her look like a memory someone had tried to keep from fading and failed. When I stepped inside, she looked up as if she already knew my footsteps. "You're the one," she said quietly. Her voice was low, controlled, as if every syllable had been examined before release. "The one," I started. "The one who keeps calling, asking about Lena, even when there's nothing new." A faint, humorless smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. "They said you'd come eventually." The door shut behind me with a soft click that sounded too final. I sat across from her, my notebook untouched. Protocol whispered checklists in my ear, but something in her posture, the slight forward lean, the way her eyes shuttered and opened like she was bracing for impact, made it feel wrong to approach her like just another witness. "I'm reviewing your sister's case," I said. A new item surfaced, her locket. Her gaze dropped to the table, as if the word itself had weight. "She never took it off," Hannah murmured. "Not even in the summer when it stuck to her skin, said it made her feel seen." She swallowed. "You really found it?" "It was sent to me," I said. "No return address." Her fingers flexed, nails faintly scraping the metal tabletop. "To you," she repeated, like that detail meant more than I understood. Silence settled between us, heavy but not empty. I watched her eyes, not just their color, but the way they seemed always on the verge of looking away and never quite doing it. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She was afraid of hearing the wrong one. "I need to ask." "She wasn't running away," Hannah interrupted, her voice suddenly strained. "I know people said that she was restless, that she wanted more than this town, but she wouldn't have left me. She wouldn't have left Mama like that." "I'm not assuming anything," I said. Her eyes flicked back to mine, sharp. "You already have. You've been living in this case for how long?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. She had no way of knowing that I spent more time with her sister's file than with my own life, that I'd memorized dates and routes and statements like a litany. Yet she spoke the truth. She leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me something. When you think of her, is it the photo from the poster? Or is it something else, some version of her you made up to fit the story in your head?" The question slid under my skin like a thin blade. I thought of the depot, of the imagined silhouette of a young woman on a bench, the locket burning against my palm, the poster from the grocery store, dulled and warped by time, that I'd forgotten seeing until the case reopened the wound. "I'm trying to find out what really happened," I said. It sounded weak even to me. Hannah studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if performing an act of faith. "Then don't just look at her as a case," she whispered. "Look at her as a person who never got to finish being alive." Her words lingered long after she left the room. The second person I spoke to was the man who used to lead this investigation. Retired Detective Frank Collier lived in a weather-beaten house near the river, the paint peeling in slow curls, the porch sagging under the weight of time and unspoken regrets. He answered the door in a faded shirt and a pair of slippers that had outlasted at least 3 administrations. "You took your time," he muttered as he let me in. "Figured someone would come knocking once that box showed up." I paused halfway across the threshold. "You knew about the locket." Frank's laugh was short and humorless. "Son, there's nothing about that case I don't know. The problem was never knowledge, it was proof." Inside, his living room smelled faintly of liniment and old books. Framed commendations hung crookedly on the wall, their glass surfaces dusted but not polished. A single photograph rested on the mantel, a younger Frank standing next to a bulletin board crowded with photos and lines of red string. I didn't have to look closely to know whose face was at the center. "You kept her case?" I asked, nodding toward the photo. He sank into an armchair and waved a hand. "Kept everything, even after they told me to let it go. Cold case," they said, "no leads," as if words could make a body reappear. "But still," I said quietly, "you walked away." He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his gaze tightened. "No," he said, "I just got old, the case stayed." There was accusation in his eyes, but it wasn't directed at me. Not entirely. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. You weren't there in '90. You didn't see the way this town held its breath and refused to exhale. He tilted his head. Or did you? For a second, the room shifted. I was 12 again, standing outside the depot on a dare. The air thick. The dark beyond the windows deeper than night had any right to be. I grew up here, I said. I remember the posters. That all? He asked. I hesitated. Is it supposed to be? He watched the way my jaw tightened, the way my fingers fidgeted with the pen in my hand before I stilled them. It was unnerving to be studied from the outside when I spent most of my life dissecting others. You remind me of me, Frank said finally. Back then. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. I thought if I solved this one, it would make up for all the ones I didn't. That's how it starts duty. Then it twists. Be careful it doesn't become the only thing that makes you feel like you exist. He reached for something on the side table, a worn folder, its edges soft and frayed. My pulse quickened. I recognized the label. Doyle, Lena M. Personal Notes. You kept your own file, I said. He nodded. Things I wrote that never made it into the official record. Observations, hunches, guilt. He slid it toward me. Take it. Maybe you'll see something I didn't, or maybe you'll just see yourself. The last person I talked to that day was the one who said almost nothing at all. Reverend Cole stood at the back of the small church, hands clasped loosely, light from the stained glass window slanting across his face in fractured colors. He'd presided over Lena's memorial. He'd consoled the town when no arrest came, when whispers turned bitter, when hope curdled into suspicion. She used to sit right there, he said, nodding toward a pew near the middle. Always in the same spot, like she wanted to be noticed and invisible at the same time. Did she talk to you? I asked. Sometimes, he smiled faintly, not with words. I frowned. I'm not sure I follow. He looked at me, his gaze more tired than holy. Grief and fear, they have their own language, son. You see it in posture. The way someone holds their breath when a name is mentioned. The way they flinch when a door closes. He tilted his head slightly. You're carrying something like that now. I shifted, suddenly uncomfortable under the colored light. He didn't press. His voice dropped to a near whisper. Whatever you uncover, remember this. The truth isn't just what happened that night. It's what this place became because of it. We all built our own versions of her story to survive it. He looked toward the empty pew. Some of us aren't ready to let those versions go. Few words, fewer answers. But their faces, their weight, pressed into me. Each of them knew a different Lena. Each of them saw a different version of the night she vanished. And somewhere between their memories and my obsession, the real story trembled, thin, fragile, easily distorted by the hands that reached for it. 5. Symbolic clues, photos, diary, patterns build intellectual intrigue. Frank's personal folder sat on my kitchen table that night like a guest I didn't remember inviting in. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hum of the refrigerator sound accusatory. I should have slept. I should have gone home in my mind as well as in body. Instead, I brewed coffee I knew I didn't need and opened the folder as if it might vanish if I hesitated. Inside were photocopies, handwritten notes and photographs that never made it into the official case file. Personal observations, small fragments of doubt, moments Frank had captured and then hidden from the record. The first photograph caught my breath. It was taken outside the grocery store, the same one where Lena's missing poster would later hang. In it, she stood by a newspaper stand, her head half turned toward the street. The image was slightly out of focus, but her posture radiated something like distracted unease. She was clutching something in her hand. A small oval shape gleamed faintly near her fingers. The locket. Behind her, blurred, crossing the edge of the frame, was a boy, maybe 12 or 13. His face was turned away, mid-step, caught in motion. Just a silhouette, really. Dark hair, thin shoulders, a familiar curve of jaw I couldn't place because I didn't want to. I studied the photo longer than necessary, the coffee cooling untouched beside me. My mind supplied possibilities, then rejected them. He could have been anyone, a stranger, a passerby, a ghost of a boy who'd never matter. But something in my chest tightened, like a memory pressing its palms against glass. I turned the photo over. On the back, Frank had scrawled in blue ink. Grocery 61090 notice boy, recurring fig. Recurring figure. So he'd seen him more than once. The next image was taken near the bus depot, a grainy zoom of children on bikes cutting across the cracked asphalt in front. One of them had the same build, same posture, face obscured by motion blur and shadow. Frank had circled him in red. Beneath it, kid again, why always near? My throat felt dry. My reflection in the kitchen window looked like someone else, eyes too hollow, shoulders too tense. I closed the folder, then opened it again, as if the act could rearrange reality. The second set of clues came from a different source. Hannah called me the next day, her voice soft with something that sounded like resignation. I found something, she said. In Mama's attic. I think it belonged to Lena. Her mother's house felt like a museum of halted time. Plastic covers on furniture, faded wallpaper with curling edges. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and old perfume. Hannah led me up the narrow staircase to the attic, ducking her head under beams she'd clearly learned to navigate long ago. I was going through boxes, she said, kneeling beside a stack of them. Mama never liked to throw anything away. I think she believed if she kept everything, she might one day find what she'd lost. She pulled out a shoebox tied with a frayed ribbon. This was hidden in the back. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed to the color of weak tea, were loose notebook pages, torn from journals perhaps, and a handful of small, square photographs. Polaroids, their colors washed out by time. They were all of ordinary things, yet nothing about them felt ordinary. A blurred shot of the river at dusk, the depot's silhouette in the distance, a close-up of chipped blue paint on a bench, a cracked mirror in what looked like a dingy bathroom, the reflection fractured into jagged segments. On almost every photo, somewhere in the frame, Lena had drawn something small in pen, 3 vertical lines crossed by a 4th. The same tally mark etched into the depot wall. She did this sometimes, Hannah whispered, looking over my shoulder. She said it helped her keep track of days or feelings, I don't know. Her voice trembled. I thought it was just a thing, a habit, but patterns. Not random. Intentional. I spread the photos out on the floorboards like a makeshift altar. The tally marks were never in the same place. Sometimes hidden in a corner, sometimes in the center, sometimes drawn over her own shadow. In a few images, I could see part of her hand or foot, suggesting she'd taken them herself. What about the pages? I asked. Hannah handed them to me, then walked away a few steps, as though stepping back from her own past. The handwriting was small, neat in places, collapsing into hurried scrawl in others. They weren't full diary entries, more like fragments, moments she'd tried to trap in ink. June 3, the depot feels like a mouth. I sit on the edge of its tongue and listen. June 9, someone watched me walk home. I counted steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mark. June 12, don't know if I'm being followed or if I've become my own shadow. June 14, ticket in my pocket, heart in my throat. If it goes wrong, at least the silence will know my name. Beneath that last line was a small drawing, 4 tally marks. I stared at the date. June 14. The ticket in my notebook bore the same ghostly imprint. A chill crawled along my spine. These weren't just symbols. They were a pattern of escalating unease, a record of someone tracking their own fear. Did she ever say who she thought was following her? I asked. Hannah shook her head, hugging herself. She didn't want to make Mama worry, said it was probably nothing, said sometimes she just felt watched. Her throat bobbed. We told her it was in her head. God, we told her that. Guilt crept into the room like a draft. It settled on both of us. I took photos of everything, scanned the pages, filed them under evidence. But the part of me that wasn't wearing a badge lingered over each word, each line, like they were messages not just from a victim, but from someone suspended in the moment before everything went wrong. That night, I spread the clues out again on my kitchen table. Frank's photos, Lena's Polaroids, the diary fragments, the locket and the ticket in their plastic sleeves. I began to notice other patterns. In the grocery store photo, just behind the blur of the boy, there was a reflection in the glass of the door, a faint duplication that suggested someone else standing to the side, outside the frame, a shape that couldn't be fully resolved. When I zoomed in, all I got was noise, but my mind kept trying to assign it a face. In one of Lena's Polaroids, the cracked mirror showed not just her hand, but what might have been a shoe behind her. Dark, male, or maybe it was just a shadow. My eyes ached from staring. The coffee had long since gone cold. The room seemed to shrink around the table until it was just me and the artifacts of a life cut short. The tally marks, the photos, the diary entries, they were intellectual puzzles, yes, but they were also something else. They were windows, and each time I looked through them, I saw a ghost of myself on the other side. A boy near the depot. A boy near the grocery store. A boy watching a town hold its breath. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself that Frank's recurring figure could have been anyone. I told myself I was too young to matter back then, too far removed to have been a part of the story in any way that counted. But the patterns didn't care what I told myself. They were there, inked into the record, silent and patient, waiting for me to stop lying. 6. Twist questions investigators' perception, blurring truth and delusion. The arrest, when it finally came, should have felt like closure. Instead, it felt like stepping into someone else's memory. It started with a name that had lingered in the periphery of the original investigation. Someone noted, questioned, then quietly filed away. Earl Maddox, bus driver, middle-aged in 1990. Widower. He'd driven the late route the night Lena vanished. Years ago, he told police he never saw her board. He passed every routine check, every basic inquiry with the tired resignation of a man burdened by other people's suspicions. Now, new forensic analysis of fabric fibers found in the depot, fibers that hadn't been properly processed back then, pointed back to a uniform brand used by the bus company at the time. A particular tear pattern matched archived photographs of Maddox's jacket from that year. The locket and ticket arriving out of nowhere felt, to everyone else, like the final push, the universe aligning to demand justice at last. To everyone else. Not to me. Because my obsession had wrapped itself so tightly around the case that nothing felt like coincidence anymore. "We got him," one of the younger detectives said, dropping the report on my desk with the satisfied thud of a verdict. "DA's ecstatic. This'll be the headline for weeks. Mississippi 1990 cold case solved, arrest shocks community. That kind of thing. Arrests, I corrected automatically, though I didn't know why I said it. The word left a strange taste in my mouth. He frowned. What, you think there was someone else? He shrugged. Maybe, but one monster's a good start. Monster. The word sat uneasily with me. People preferred monsters, made things easier, cleaner. But when I sat across from Maddox in the interrogation room, I didn't see a monster. I saw an old man with rheumy eyes and hands that shook slightly as he reached for the water bottle. I told them everything back then, he rasped, voice rough from age or cigarettes or both. Told them I never saw that girl. You think I wouldn't remember a thing like that? I watched him closely. His gaze didn't skitter. His breathing didn't quicken. He looked less like a predator and more like someone who'd been waiting decades for the world to decide what role he would play in a story he couldn't escape. Evidence doesn't care about our impressions. That's what they teach you. But when evidence arrives in a box with no return address, addressed specifically to you, it begins to feel personal. How did the fibers get there, Earl? I asked. In the depot, on the seat near the back entrance. He stared at the table. I used to cut through there, he muttered. When it closed down, old habits, walk the route even when there weren't no buses left to drive. He shook his head. Sat on the benches, smoked, thought about nothing, or tried to. You lived just beyond the depot, didn't you? I said, remembering a line from Frank's notes. Yeah, his eyes flickered, and so did half the ghosts in this town. I pressed, following procedure, saying all the things a good investigator would say. But underneath the questions, another voice murmured, "Why did they send the locket to you?" My sleep had thinned into fragile layers in the days leading up to the arrest. Dreams came in fragmented flashes, the depot's dark mouth yawning, Lena's tally marks on walls that shouldn't exist, the faceless boy in the photos turning slowly toward me. In one dream, he finally turned all the way. He had my face. I woke gasping, the taste of rusted air in my throat, my heart sprinting as if I'd just been caught doing something I shouldn't. The thought arrived then, unwelcome and yet undeniable. What if I had seen her? What if 12-year-old me, biking past the depot or loitering near the grocery store, had been closer to the truth than anyone realized, and done nothing? Memory is supposed to be a record, but it's more often a story we keep rewriting until it hurts less. I began to wonder how many pages I'd torn out without meaning to. The final fracture came when I found the handwriting. I was going through my old storage boxes, digging for an unrelated document when one of them tipped over. Papers spilled out, school assignments, doodled maps of the town, half-finished letters I'd never sent. Among them, buried deep, was an envelope with no address. Inside was a slip of paper. On it, in my own hand but uneven, as if written in the dark, were 4 words. She didn't get on. The pen pressure was heavy, the letters pressed into the paper so hard they nearly tore. Beneath the words was a small drawing, 3 vertical lines crossed by a 4th. My stomach churned, my hands went cold. I didn't remember writing it. I didn't remember ever confessing anything to paper about that night, about any night, about a girl whose disappearance shaped the quiet in this town. Yet there it was, my handwriting, her symbol. I sank onto the floor, the room tilting, the edges of my vision dimming around the center. For a moment, I wasn't sure which year it was. I could hear crickets outside like a chorus of distant whispers. I could smell the faint tang of diesel from a passing bus that no longer existed. A thought pierced through the haze, sharp and unforgiving. If I could forget writing that note, What else had I forgotten? The line between what I knew and what I believed I knew began to blur. Had I truly never seen Lena board the bus? Or had I seen her hesitate at the depot's entrance and then walk away into the dark, deciding at the last second not to run? In my mind, the images overlapped. A girl stepping onto a bus, a girl turning back, a girl standing still while the world moved around her. In one version, she is lost to a stranger. In another, she is lost to a choice. In a third, she is lost to my failure to speak up at the right moment. The locket in the box. Addressed to me. No return. A wild theory surfaced, irrational and yet impossible to ignore. What if I sent it? What if some part of me, unable to bear the stagnation, had unearthed the locket found years ago, pocketed by a scared boy who didn't understand its weight, and mailed it in a half-conscious act? An invitation to reopen the past, to punish someone, anyone, so the silence would finally say something back. I searched my mind for the memory of mailing it and found only static. But absence of recall isn't proof of innocence. It's just more empty space for dread to fill. When the arrest warrant for Maddox moved forward, the town responded exactly how you'd expect. Shock, outrage, a flood of old grief bristling with a new target. How could he walk among us all these years? Someone asked at a town hall. I always knew there was something off about him, another whispered. People rewrite history faster than any report. In the chaos, I stood at the back, the note burning a hole in my pocket, the tally marks etched behind my eyes. I watched faces glow with the dark satisfaction of finally having someone to blame. Yet through it all, a single question echoed. Was Maddox the truth? Or just a shape we'd poured our fear into? I thought of Frank's words. Be careful it doesn't become the only thing that makes you feel like you exist. Had I followed the evidence? Or had I nudged it just enough to align with a story where I was necessary, where my guilt could be transformed into justice? The case, once an external object, had infiltrated me. Now I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. And in the quiet moments, walking down long hallways, standing alone in my kitchen at 3 a.m., hearing the phantom echo of a bus that no longer ran, I started to suspect that the greatest distortion wasn't the town. It was mine. 7. Ending feels haunting and unresolved. Truth brings no peace. The headline came exactly as predicted, bold and triumphant across the local paper. Mississippi 1990 Cold Case, SOLVID, ARRESTS Shock Community. Arrests plural. Earl Maddox, bus driver. And days later, a second name, added like an afterthought that unraveled everything. Frank Collier. Accessory after the fact, withholding potential evidence, interfering with the original investigation. The revelation hit like a slow, muffled explosion. It wasn't that anyone believed Frank had hurt Lena. Even the DA stopped short of suggesting direct violence. But someone, somewhere in the chain, had decided that decades of private notes, unsanctioned digging, and withheld suspicions constituted obstruction. That his obsession, like mine, had twisted the shape of the case. They traced the unprocessed fibers, the forgotten witness statements, the missing supplemental report that might have prompted a deeper look at Maddox back then. The paper framed it succinctly. Retired detectives' missteps delayed justice for nearly 3 decades. In the photograph beside the article, Frank looked smaller than I remembered. His eyes, once sharp with stubborn focus, appeared stunned, not at the charges, I suspected, but at the idea that his devotion could be rebranded as failure. The town got what it thought it wanted, Names, charges, the illusion of a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. But the air didn't feel lighter. It felt thick, like we were all breathing through cloth soaked in old tears. At the press conference, the DA spoke of closure, of resilience, of justice finally served. Cameras flashed. Applause came in hesitant waves. People needed to believe that the story had finally solidified into something they could hold without cutting their hands. I stood near the back, the note still folded in my pocket, the edges softening with each anxious touch. She didn't get on. Each word pulsed against my leg like a heartbeat. If I believed the new narrative, then on the night of June 14, 1990, Lena went to the depot with her ticket, intending to leave town. Maddox saw her. Something happened. She never made it onto the bus. Decades later, fiber analysis, a resurfaced Locket, and an old detective's questionable judgment converged into a legal truth. But the deeper truth, the one that lived in the spaces between diary fragments and Polaroids and whispered memories, remained elusive. I visited the depot one last time. The sun was low, staining the sky the color of old bruises. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows reflecting the dying light in scattered splinters. The air smelled like damp concrete, and something else I couldn't name, a residue of absence. Inside, the shadows were softer than before, as if the place had finally exhaled. Dust floated in the air like lazy constellations. The tallies on the wall were still there, faint but visible, 3 vertical lines crossed by a 4th, counting something no one had bothered to decode while it still mattered. I walked to the center of the room, paused where the tiles changed color. The faint circular stain was still there, the same place where I'd first felt the weight of her story settle into my bones. Closing my eyes, I let the silence speak. It said nothing concrete. No revelation. No sudden recollection of a night from my childhood where I saw too much and said too little. Instead, it murmured feelings, fragments. A bike wheel skidding. Laughter cut short. A girl's silhouette at the edge of the depot's mouth, undecided. A boy watching from across the street, telling himself it wasn't his business. Memory twisted under my skin. Had I been there? Had I merely imagined myself into the scene because I needed to believe I could have changed it? That my failure to act made me part of the story, that my guilt was earned, not borrowed. Obsession has a way of rewriting the past until you're not sure whether you're chasing a truth or building one. I took the note from my pocket. The paper had softened, the ink slightly smudged where sweat and time had met. She didn't get on. Was I recording something I'd witnessed, or trying to convince myself of a version that absolved me of seeing worse? With a slow, careful movement, I folded the note smaller and slid it into the crack between 2 tiles at my feet. An unmarked confession left in the mouth of the place that had swallowed so much already. I didn't know if it belonged here, but I knew I could no longer carry it alone. On my way out, I paused at the wall and raised my hand, hesitating before pressing my fingertip to the dust. I drew one more mark next to the faint tallies, a 5th line crossing the others. Not to count days. To acknowledge the weight of everything we'd never know. Outside, the town went on. People talked about the arrests in grocery store aisles, at church potlucks, on porches facing streets where children still rode their bikes. Some were angry that it had taken so long. Others were angry that their memories of certain people had to be rewritten. Old loyalties cracked. Old suspicions resurfaced, rebranded as warnings no one had heeded. Hannah attended Maddox's arraignment, her face a pale mask of composure. She didn't look triumphant. She looked hollow, as if each new step toward justice only carved out more of what little remained inside. When our eyes met afterward, she gave me a small nod that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite blame. Something in between. Something complicated. "Does it feel better?" I asked quietly. Her lips parted, then closed. She thought for a moment, eyes distant. "It feels different," she said finally, "but not better." She looked past me toward the courthouse steps. I wanted answers, not this. A weak, brittle laugh escaped her. I thought when we knew, I'd be able to picture her last moments and finally let them go. But all I see now are gaps, darkness between the facts. She glanced at me. "Do you see them too?" "Yes," I said, and I did, more clearly than ever. Frank, out on bail, sat alone in his house by the river, surrounded by years of work that had shifted overnight from dedication to evidence of obstruction. Whether he'd made certain choices to protect the investigation or to protect himself, I didn't know. Maybe he didn't either. Maddox awaited trial, his public image collapsing under the weight of headlines. Whether he was guilty of everything the town now believed, or only some quieter sin that had become a vessel for their rage, I couldn't truly say. The case against him was strong, legally solid, emotionally satisfying. But certainty had become, for me, just another kind of illusion. Back at the precinct, Lena's file received a new label. Cleared, conviction expected. I traced the letters with my eyes, not my hand. They felt like a verdict on all of us. In the nights that followed, sleep remained thin. I dreamed less of monsters and more of mundane scenes laden with dread. A bus idling at a curb, a girl hesitating at the top step, a boy watching from a distance and choosing silence because he believed it wasn't his place to interrupt. Sometimes in the dream she gets on. Sometimes she doesn't. In neither version does the fear leave my throat. I kept working other cases. Life didn't stop because one old wound had been cauterized in public. New victims, new families, new silences filling new rooms. Yet whenever I passed by the archives, my gaze snagged on Lena's file like fabric on a nail. I no longer opened it. I no longer needed to. The case might have been solved on paper, but in my mind it remained what it had always been. A shifting echo in a town that had learned to speak around its absence. Justice had come. The community had its story. Names were assigned to shadows. But peace was something else entirely. Peace was what might have happened if someone, a driver, a detective, a boy outside a depot, had stepped in at the right moment and derailed whatever fate had been gathering itself that night. We didn't get that. We got headlines and handcuffs, and the uneasy knowledge that our truths are built from recollections as fragile and unreliable as breath on glass. One evening, months later, I drove past the old depot at dusk. It was a reflex, a muscle memory I couldn't fully unlearn. The building hunched against the fading light, a silhouette of rust and neglect. For the first time, I didn't stop. I slowed, but I kept going. In the rearview mirror, its shape receded, swallowed by distance and shadow. Yet it remained inside me, as permanent as a scar, a place where silence had once carried more truth than any testimony. The case was solved. The town moved on. The file gathered dust with a new label. But some stories, once they enter you, never truly end. They live on as a quiet unease at the edge of your thoughts, a whisper under normal days, a ghost that doesn't rattle chains so much as rearrange how you see yourself. Lena Mercy Doyle remained 22 forever. Her last moments were known, and not known all at once. And in the space between what we believed and what we could prove, Something essential was lost, something no conviction could ever retrieve. Truth had come wearing a badge and a courtroom seal. Peace, however, never arrived. It stayed behind, somewhere in the dark corners of an abandoned depot, counting itself in silent tallies only the conscience could see.